Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm at the Center for American Progress. Joining me today is Gil Troy. He's a professor of history at McGill University, a contributor to the Open Zion blog at the Daily Beast Newsweek. He's also the author of the recently released book, Moynihan's Moment, America's Fight Against Zionism as Racism. Welcome, Professor Troy.
Great to be with you, Matt.
Yeah, really glad you could do this. It's your first time on Blogging Heads. It's always great to have new contributors here. So last night yesterday we saw elections in Israel. A surprising outcome, I think, to many was the very strong showing by the Yesh Atid party of former Israeli newscaster Yair Lapid. Just go ahead and give us the lay of the land a little bit and some of the major takeaways as you see them.
Well, one of the great things about yesterday was we reminded once again that democracy works and democracy surprises. The pollsters had said that Yesh Atid would get about 12 votes in the Knesset, and it ended up with 18 or 19. And the simple fact that there was a last-minute surge reminds us of that magical alchemy that you have in democracy. We also saw a reminder that for all the talk over the last couple of months about Bibi Netanyahu's Israel and complaints that Israel's turning right-wing, that Israel's turning racist, that Israel's turning anti-democratic, that Israel's turning theocratic, that in fact it's a much more complicated country. In fact, in many ways parallels America's red-blue split, that there's a major debate going on in the country about the peace process, about the future of the country, about the country's character, and that was played out in the elections. So yesterday we saw a kind of reset button being pressed. We saw Bibi Netanyahu getting a real lesson that he has to lead, and I think he's failed to lead so far in the 4 years that he's been prime minister. And we also saw a major push from the Israeli center and the Israeli middle class saying, we're not happy with the direction of the country. We're not happy with the drift under Netanyahu.
So getting to that, it seems that when I look at some of the major issues that Yesh Atid was pushing and what others, such as labor, were focusing on, they were domestic economic issues. There's also the issue of the Haredi parties and Israel's ultra-Orthodox not serving in the military and some of the subsidies that they get for study while not working. Do you think that's fair to say? I mean, do you think we're going to see movement on those issues? I mean, these have been talked about, especially the latter issue has been talked about quite a bit over the past few years. Yet it seems, given the reliance that Netanyahu's had on those parties for his coalition, do you think now, if he forms a coalition with Yesh Atid, that he'll be freer to move on that?
I'm smiling because I've learned long ago not to predict Israeli politics. Just a couple of months ago, when Netanyahu went into a coalition with Shaul Mofaz's Kadima, and it was precisely to solve the problem of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi draft exemption issue, I was sure. I was foolishly sure that something would happen, and lo and behold, something did happen. The coalition fell apart within a couple of weeks. So I won't go to prediction mode, but what I will say is this, is that Yesh Atid was very clear that they had a red line. And one of the red lines was this whole notion of the exemption to ultra-Orthodox. And one of the interesting things about Yesh Atid was they weren't trying to be flamethrowers. They weren't trying to say the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, are evil or not part of our society or not part of our community. And they came out with a 5-year plan. They said, we have to transition. We have to have special army units. We have to think this through. And I think both those things impressed Israeli voters. One, that they were saying we have a core principle. We're not just going to go in for, everybody in Israel talks about the Volvos that you get when you're a minister. So we're not just going to go in for our Volvos, and we're not going to just go in to be in the coalition for power. And we're not just making a big statement and trying to get lots of play on it. We're having a thoughtful plan. The most effective campaign commercial that Yair Lapid ran was one literally, and he's an Israeli celebrity, an Israeli journalist, well known to the public, and the commercial ran upside down at first. And he said, this country's upside down. We can't continue to be giving subsidies to those who don't work, to those who don't serve in the army. We can't continue to have an education system which is best for those who aren't contributing. And then, of course, he writes things up and says, we're going to right the society. So I think that that's definitely going to be a central issue. Netanyahu has said he wants as broad a coalition as possible, and I think Netanyahu, as I said earlier, has learned a little bit of a lesson. So I'll say that the tea leaves are looking positive, but I won't predict.
So just for, since, our audience is mostly American, for comparison's sake, Yair Lapid, would this be like Tom Brokaw running for office, or is it more like Walter Cronkite, someone who's even bigger?
Yeah, I mean, it is a kind of Tom Brokaw guy because there is somebody else who's more of a Walter Cronkite guy who's been there for decades as the newscast as a news anchor of the most popular show Chaim Yavin. So I would say that this is a kind of major celebrity. He definitely has a Reagan-esque touch. He's charming and he's well known. He's written bestsellers. And his father also went into politics, and that's also interesting. His father was a television personality who went into politics, as did he.
So I want to go back to something you just said, which I found a little curious, is that you said that the election returns show that there is an ongoing debate about the peace process. Now, I know that Lapid made a number of statements. He's just basically saying, yes, we need to re-engage in the peace process. Notably, one of those speeches he made from the Ariel settlement. But he did say things about the peace process, none of which were too outside the box. I mean, they seem to be kind of the regular things that you hear. The peace process is good. We should do it. But in general, it seems to me that the focus was much, much more on domestic issues, economic issues, the ultra-Orthodox issue. And the lesson here seems to be that you can win. I mean, the takeaway, it seemed to me, would be for Yesh Atid would be that you can win by focusing on issues other than the peace process. And the only party that focused on the peace process in any big way was Meretz, which we should recognize actually doubled its own number of seats in the Knesset. But it seems I'm a bit surprised to hear you say that there is a big debate about the peace process, because it seems that there's very little debate at this point.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to put some nuance there. First of all, I agree with you on the whole that the election was mostly about domestic policy. It was mostly about, there was actually a Haaretz headline this week, "The Economy's Stupid." It was about the economy. It was about a new multi-billion-dollar deficit that they discovered in the last couple of weeks. It was about middle-class housing. It was about the social protest movement. It was about this Haredi ultra-Orthodox exemption. But I think underlying it was also a question of the torpor in the peace process, because one of the things we also saw during this election was a poll that was publicized by the left-leaning Haaretz that most Israelis are in favor of a two-state solution. And we now have a prime minister, the right-wing prime minister, Netanyahu, at the beginning of his term, gave a big speech endorsing the two-state solution. So I think that where it played out was a feeling that things are just a little bit too stuck, that Bibi, as they call Netanyahu, has been too passive. And that's where it plays out.
Interesting. Too passive. I mean, given that his reputation outside of the country, as someone who really represents himself as sort of boldly defending Israel's rights, to continue to build settlements and to resist pressure and everything. It's interesting that he would be seen inside the country as too passive.
Yeah, that's been a frustration. People say that he writes books about Winston Churchill and he tries to come across as this kind of proud lion.
Right.
But in fact, on the whole, he's been far too fearful of his coalition partners, far too fearful, let's say, of dropping from 42 to 31, which is exactly what happened because he didn't show the boldness that Israelis wanted.
Right, and he has very little to show for his first term. Do you think that's fair to say, legislatively or otherwise?
Yes, I mean, with all due respect to the prime minister, I kept on comparing him in my columns to a Chicago ward healer, a politician who's just worried about keeping things going and maintaining the status quo, as opposed to the Churchillian statesman he pretends he wants to be.
Yeah. I'm curious, what do you think? There was a lot of talk in the Israeli media over the past couple of weeks about, and some here in the United States, about the President Obama's supposed intervention or meddling, whatever word you want to use, in the comment that was reported by Jeffrey Goldberg, that was leaked to Jeffrey Goldberg, and there's all kinds of debate whether it was an intentional leak, etc. But people in which President Obama was quoted as saying that Netanyahu doesn't know what his own country's best interests are, and Netanyahu campaigned against that, saying it's noted, making an allusion to that, I will resist this sort of pressure. Do you think that made any impact at all?
Ironically, the impact, according to the newspapers, was that it hurt Netanyahu. People think that sometimes when an Israeli prime minister comes and looks all aggressive and stares down the president of the United States, it makes him look stronger. But in fact, this first set of polls after that leaked story came out showed a further weakening in Netanyahu's position. Now we know that there were other factors going on as well. But in general, I think that especially after the election, a lot of people felt that Netanyahu, who prides himself on being this master tactician, on knowing the United States of America, had overplayed his hands with the Romney campaign and in telegraphing a certain support for Romney. And they were basically saying, you know what? It's not working. It's backfiring on us. But I have to say, in general, I'm shocked that either the American president would entertain any thoughts of meddling in the Israeli election, or that the Israeli prime minister would ever entertain any thoughts of meddling in the American election. I don't believe it would happen. That was sarcastic.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That was my next question.
Right.
Oh, good. I'm glad we're on the same page.
Yeah. Clinton did the same thing, by the way.
Right. I mean, that's where I was going with that. I mean, because I think up till now, I mean, the difference between Netanyahu now and Netanyahu then is that you had a president in Clinton who was very, very popular in Israel, and so I think there's a baseline discomfort among Israelis, with how the prime minister is stewarding the U.S.-Israel relationship. But I think it's massively amplified and exacerbated if you have a president who Israelis trust, which was the case with Clinton and is much less the case with Obama, although I think he has done quite a bit of work over the past few years to repair that deficit. So would you say that the impact that quote made is a sign that Obama has to some extent repaired that trust deficit with Israelis?
In some ways, there was no polling on it, but my guess is almost that the polling would have shown a little bit of a drop in Obama's support in Israel, as well as a drop in Netanyahu's support in Israel. I think when Americans and Israelis are fighting, when the American president and the Israeli prime minister is fighting, it's about as popular here as in a home when the mom and dad are fighting. Israelis understand that their best friend is the United States of America. Israelis don't want tension on that score. And one of the points that I keep on making in my articles and in this new book I wrote on Moynihan's moment is that the American-Israel relationship takes place on two levels. There's what I call the transactional, where there are occasional tensions, Henry Kissinger and his shuttle diplomacy, Barack Obama with the Palestinian issue, but there's also a core existential, fundamental relationship, a core fundamental existential bond that's much deeper. And the language that we use misleads. Because when we talk about somebody being pro-Israel or anti-Israel, it suggests that in the United States of America, there isn't this deep consensus about being pro-Israel. So we need a new language where we'll talk about dovish or hawkish or pro-settlement or anti-settlement. But this anti-Israel, pro-Israel business is for the birds.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think, I mean, that's an entire segment in itself right there.
Yes.
That's really interesting. I mean, I've actually gone back and forth on the usefulness of those terms. Lately, I've come back to the position that I think redefining, maybe not that the terms are useless, but yet redefining what it means to actually be pro-Israel, because I think you're right in a lot of respects about the deep kind of cultural identification that exists between Israelis and Americans on a number of questions. But yeah, maybe we can do that another time. I still want to get to some of the implications of the election. So, getting back to the peace process, even though it was not a major issue, it was mentioned. It was mentioned by Yair Lapid himself. Do you think we're going to see? Again, I know you don't want to make predictions, and that's probably a wise choice. But what could we see in terms of the peace process, given that it's likely that any coalition will probably include right-wing parties like Naftali Bennett's party? Are we going to see any movement, or are we just going to see more gridlock?
Well, I think you have to look at it in two different ways. One is, right now, the question about who's going to enter the coalition is up for grabs. And in this morning's Yediot Ahronot, which is one of the most popular mainstream newspapers, they had a chart showing 4 different coalition possibilities. One, a completely right-wing coalition possibility, which didn't even have Lapid, to one left-wing coalition possibility, which didn't even have Netanyahu. The most likely mix is going to start with Netanyahu and Lapid, which gives you about 50, 51 seats, and then build, if you add Bennett and you add Tzipi Livni, let's say, you have a very interesting mix that's, right-leaning but centrist. Lapid has basically endorsed the Clinton plan, where he talks about keeping the settlements that are the Israeli settlements that are basically suburbs that extend the Israeli boundary. You compensate Palestinians by trading some territory in the Negev in the south, but he accepts a two-state solution. Again, I think that while there wasn't a lot of debate about the peace process, there is a desire for some kind of action. And I'll also say, by the way, that I think that in the wake of the Intifada and the wake of all the terror, a little bit of passivity and a little bit of quiet is a good thing. There's that everybody thinks, the prospects are dying because there isn't a major Jimmy Carter-like Camp David agreement or an Oslo peace process. And I think in the wake of the trauma of the Oslo process falling apart and then the Gaza disengagement leading to so many Hamas missiles, if we have a couple of years where we have some security cooperation between the Palestinians and Israelis as we're seeing on the ground, if we have a couple of years where we have a lifting of checkpoints as we've seen on the ground, then that might lead to a kind of a peaceful, more calm discussion about the future. I think too much of what goes on takes place with all this hysteria and with all this desire for drama.
Well, I think that's a fair point. I mean, one thing I would note is that, that peace and that security and that normalcy takes place on the Israeli side. That's not something the Palestinians experience. They are still living with occupation and checkpoints and closure. The second point is how much peace and security and security cooperation do you really need on the part of the Palestinians before you stop saying that there's no partner for peace, as even Yair Lapid has said. I mean, there's a pretty strong consensus among the security establishment, among the U.S. security establishment, on the international monitors that the cooperation between the PA and the Israelis has been very deep and very strong and very productive. The Palestinians have, to a great extent, fulfilled their commitments under the roadmap to stop terrorism in the West Bank. Granted, there's the divide between Hamas and Fatah in Gaza and the West Bank, and that's a whole other issue. But it seems that the PA under Abbas and Fayyad have come a very long way, and to see them continue to be derided as not partners, I mean, one could see how that would really, really undermine the entire argument that being moderate and seeking to deal with things politically and through negotiations and non-violently, one could see how that argument kind of gets undermined when they continue to be condemned in this way.
Let me say 3 things about that. First of all, my point about the checkpoints and security cooperation talked about the Palestinian side as well as the Israeli side, that there's been a major improvement in Palestinian quality of life over the last couple of years, too, if you compare it to 2002, 2003. There's more prosperity. The occupation does continue. I'm not giving a red, white, and blue spin, but there has been improvement on both sides, and if there's more improvement on both sides and there's more normalization, that's to me a good important step in the right direction. That's number one. Number two is I fundamentally agree with you. I think that in some ways Israel has been far more effective in that weird dynamic you sometimes see with substitute teachers of responding to yelling, of responding to extremism, and not fostering moderation. And I've spoken to Palestinian moderates in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem who say, we need your help. We need, you pulled out of Gaza, but what you did, and you did it in such a way because you didn't negotiate with Abbas, that it became spun as a victory for Hamas. Now, number three, though, I think we do have to put in some nuance that, we have to deal with Israelis' trauma. And part of the Israelis' trauma comes from the Oslo peace process, ending up with violence. It comes from the Gaza disengagement ending up with all these rockets. And third, it comes from things like the UN appearance of Abbas leading to a language of ethnic cleansing and racism and apartheid. So let's take responsibility on both sides. Let's lower the rhetorical temperature on both sides, and let's see if we can have leadership, not from the President of the United States, but from the President of the PA and the new Prime Minister with hopefully a new emboldened coalition to make progress. Because the contours of the deal are there, and there's a possibility for peace.
Yeah, I mean, even after the last round of Gaza fighting, it seems that Hamas again came out of that proclaiming victory, showing that we've showed once again that violence works. It gets us recognition. It puts us at the table with some of the major actors. So I guess we can we can, yes, Abbas's speech at the UN was disappointing in how aggressive it was, but at the same time, he's got to appeal to his own, political constituency, and of course that's troubling that he needs to use such language to demonstrate his credibility as a Palestinian nationalist. But it's always interesting to me how how American commentators tend to make more allowances for Israeli politics and the certain things that are said with regard to maintaining control over all of Jerusalem, building more settlements, and saying, well, that's Israeli politics. Whereas it seems like interpreting Palestinian political behavior is much less charitable. But the fact of the matter is, they both have to deal with politics, and they're both, Abbas and Netanyahu, even though I think they're different in many ways, are both dealing from considerable pressure from their right wings.
I think, the Israeli narrative often is the opposite, that they feel that the Palestinians get a free pass and are allowed to have martyr squares and celebrate terrorism, and it's the Israelis who are often accused of being the obstructionists. And I say let's not get into that, he said, she said kind of argument. Let's think about where are the real obstacles to peace, and let's think about what can be the confidence-building measures from both sides that will help change the dynamics. Because it's frustrating when it's kind of like this, this Greek myth where there's something tantalizing there, and there's a possibility, and it just keeps on moving the closer you get.
So I guess we didn't really, because again, we don't know what the coalition looks like. So a lot of my question about the implications of yesterday's vote on the peace process sort of hinge on that. But I mean, in the best, if you could describe your best scenario for what moves the peace process toward a two-state solution, what would that look like? Are you comfortable just kind of sketching that out?
Sure.
I mean, what does Abbas do? What does the Israeli government do? What does the United States do? Is that something you want to chat about quickly?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd say this. First of all, in terms of a realistic yet optimistic read of the coalition politics, is that the smart money suggests that you'll have Netanyahu and Lapid, and Netanyahu will have almost no choice but to go in with Bennett and his and his more right-wing nationalist party. The question is if they also bring in Tzipi Livni, and then you have Tzipi Livni and Lapid, who are considered center-left but very much centrists, and Bennett and Netanyahu, and then there's this whole curveball with Shas, because Shas is known on the one hand as the ultra-Orthodox party, but on the other hand, the ultra-Orthodox sometimes end up being peaceniks because their issue is much more about internal dynamics, and they're much less committed to territory and to what's called Eretz Yisrael Shlema, full Israel, than Bennett and his people. So if you have if you have those players in the coalition, Tzipi Livni, for example, has said that for her, restarting the peace process is one of her red lines. So how do you do it? So let's say you have some kind of coalition that's more leaning toward the center and more leaning toward the left and more leaning toward action than you had in Netanyahu's first term, which of course was his second term because he had been prime minister 10 years before. The next steps would be, I think, let's look at three different actors. You have Obama, you have Abbas, and you have Netanyahu. Obama has to step up in some ways and understand that the American president can be helpful but also can be harmful. And that sometimes by putting too much pressure, especially on Israel, he makes Israelis feel uncomfortable. And there's a kind of passive-active game he has to play, but he has to show that the timing is right for some movement. Bibi Netanyahu, and by the way, there's been settlement growth within each particular settlement, but there haven't really been new settlements recently. There's been a kind of unspoken settlement freeze. But both Netanyahu and Abbas have to think about what are the steps that they can, within their own political dynamics, make to start building some confidence. And they have to start going to the negotiation table. There was an attempt at negotiating, what was about 2 years ago, and it fizzled because neither of them were really ready to do it. And if Netanyahu feels that the Israeli public wants some action, then he'll start making some steps, some confidence-building steps in the right direction that go beyond the ones that have been off the table. The lifting of checkpoints and the improved security cooperation, which has been done under Netanyahu, I think has been very important. But now he has to figure out a way. Maybe he freezes the settlements. My friend Yossi Klein-Halevi says, freeze the settlements. Just put a freeze on without being asked, without being bullied. Start with that, and then see what happens. And this has been Netanyahu's failure. If he thinks that Abbas isn't ready, right, and we know from the failure of the Olmert plan, it could be that Abbas isn't ready, then prove it. Get up there and make a big speech. And I'd say the same thing to Abbas. Go to the UN next time and give an I have a dream speech. Don't give a I hate you speech. If either of them wanted to sort of embarrass the other, but also really make some progress, they would move beyond the small box that they've constructed for themselves and start being a little bolder.
Right. I think the line that I heard from some of Netanyahu's advisors was, we're waiting for Abbas to give his Bears 8 speech to match Netanyahu's Bar Ilan speech.
Right. And Netanyahu gave that speech 4 years ago. And again, I think that there's something positive about what Netanyahu did, because I think if 5 years from now there is a peace process or there's an agreement, we'll look back at Netanyahu's period as a time when the consensus narrowed and the simple inevitability and predictability and advisability of a Palestinian state became part and parcel of the Israeli conversation, in the same way that during the Oslo peace process, Israelis acknowledged Palestinian nationalism in a way they hadn't done before. Unfortunately, that parallel process hasn't quite occurred in certain parts of the Palestinian Authority. And once you start having that acknowledgement of reality, two states for two peoples in love with the same land, a need for some kind of compromise, you'll have progress on both sides.
Right. Well, I think that's interesting, and I want to move over to the Iran question quickly, or in just a few moments here. But it seems to me that this polling information, and there was a recent poll that was done by Zogby called "Is Peace Possible?" that polled both Israelis and Palestinians, and notably Palestinians both in the West Bank and Gaza and in the various other countries where the refugees live, Lebanon, Jordan, and elsewhere. And it found, a fairly strong support for two states for a number of reasons. One of which was, it's just the best of the possible options. But again, it seemed, I was actually surprised by how strong the support continued to be, given that my own experience and the reporting and other reporting that I've seen indicated that there is a rising sense among, especially younger Palestinian activists, that they're tired of this two-state framework. They essentially just, as one young Palestinian activist said to me, I'm tired of arguing about land. I just want my rights. Give me an Israeli passport, whatever. Just give me a passport and give me my rights. So I found the data that suggested that support for two states is still pretty strong amongst Palestinians to be encouraging. Now I think it's just a question of how do you mobilize that? How do you really activate that? So the question is, is Abbas that sort of leader? I think the question is kind of open there.
Yeah, look, there are serious questions about Abbas's leadership, and there are serious questions, of course, about Abbas's legitimacy, given that his mandate has run out and he hasn't run for re-election. And but we're not talking about a democratic country in the same way. I think one of my major obsessions, and it's one of the central themes of this new book of mine, Moynihan's Moment, is about the continuing toxicity that comes from delegitimization. The continuing toxicity that comes from the talk about Israel as a racist place, as Zionism is racism, Israel apartheid, and we're starting to see that on, the annual intellectual attacks on American campuses with that. We don't realize how much that helps the extremists in both camps. We don't realize how much that toxicity adds more obstacles to the peace process. And if the left took on the fight against delegitimization as a core value and really felt it as Israelis say, in the kishkas, in your innards, as essential to a precondition for making peace, I think we'd see a major change, because it's not just the Hamas charter, it's Palestinian rhetoric, and of course that delegitimizing rhetoric is then echoed on the Israeli right. It has been a gift to the right wing on both sides. It's been a gift to the extremists. And that kind of lowering of the rhetorical temperature is the kind of thing that Daniel Patrick Moynihan saw as necessary in 1975, and we now need to see it in 2013 as a part of the preconditions to peace.
Right, I think that's interesting, but again, it gets to the sort of balance that I walk as a progressive, and I think others who are on the left side of the debate and understand that some of these issues are very complicated, supporting Israel's right to exist, supporting the two-state solution, and supporting the U.S.-Israel relationship as I do, but still not backing away from criticizing some of the extremely ugly aspects of occupation. So, do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, but I think this is one of the core arguments here that you can do both, right? And what happens is that by allowing the delegitimizers to occupy too much of the quote-unquote anti-Israel space, by allowing them to dominate the debate, it blurs the debate over what I was calling before transactional issues versus existential issues, that it blurs the whole conversation about pro-Israel and anti-Israel. And if instead it could be very clear, and again, coming from progressives, saying, I'm outraged by Jews who delegitimize Palestinians, and I'm equally outraged by Palestinians who delegitimize Jews and Jewish nationalism, and say we need to first detoxify. Once we detoxify, then we can get to boundaries. But it's funny. I mean, my book is not focusing on boundaries and settlements. It's focusing on the question of this great big lie, this big red lie, as Moynihan called it, of Zionism being racism. But again and again, especially progressives say to me, well, what about the Palestinians? What about the settlements? And I say, can't we have two different thoughts in our head? Can't we focus on one issue and then at another time focus on another issue? Why do we constantly blur the two? And by blurring the two, it actually creates enough of a smokescreen for the extremists on both sides to continue to either expand and make more trouble, or to simply lead to a kind of stability and torpor that is against progressive ideals and progressive visions.
Yeah, I certainly recognize the impact that the sense of delegitimization would make amongst the Israeli public. I don't minimize that at all. But I think when I look at the impact that sort of as sort of psychological impact, I totally recognize it. But as something that actually impacts policy, I see it as very, very minimal. When I'm looking at the actual debate that takes place here in Washington with regard to Israel, I see something that goes almost entirely in the other direction. It is the very, very extremely ultra pro-Israel faction that tends to blur the line between criticizing Israel and being anti-Israel. And I think this is a great way to segue right into the Hagel discussion. Mm-hmm. I think one can take issue with some of the terminology he's used on, the quote Jewish lobby, was impolitic. But these constant assertions that he's anti-Semitic, or the more cowardly one used by Bret Stephens, that he smells like an anti-Semite. This I think if at least equally, if not more, tends to blur the line between an actual policy debate and delegitimizing Israel.
Well, first of all, I connect the dots. I think that because of the general atmosphere of delegitimization, it leads to a hysteria, which leads some of the more rabid people on the pro-Israel side to immediately see anti-Semites and anti-Israeli sentiments behind every critic. And from the start of the Hagel debate, I was very clear about the fact that he wasn't my favorite choice. I have criticisms of his choice, but I don't use the word anti-Semite to describe Chuck Hagel. I don't use the word anti-Israel, and I think it distorts the debate because, again, it goes back to my earlier point that the core consensus in America is so pro-Israel. And when you take the camera and pull it back and look at what goes on now in Europe, what goes on in the Middle East, you really see anti-Israel sentiments. So let's use that phrase anti-Israel and sometimes anti-Semitism to describe what's going on there. And let's use different language to say, I think the dishonesty that strikes me in the Hegel debate has been twofold. One is that a few extremists on the pro-Israel side, again, I'm using that in quotation marks, but in the anti-Hegel side, let's say, use the term anti-Semitic. And immediately, in an old tactic of innuendo, anyone who criticized Hegel was being accused of, or had to somehow show, I'm not accusing him of that. And so we have to be careful of the hysteria that comes from both sides. That's number one. But number two,
I don't know about that. I mean, come on. I mean, you've got the Wall Street Journal, you've got Jennifer Rubin in the Washington Post, you've got the various affiliates of the Bill Kristol empire, you've got Danielle Pletka of the American Enterprise Institute. These are not, as much as I might wish these were all fringe figures, they are not.
Right, but you've also mentioned, but it's interesting, you've mentioned conservative figures. I was reading, accusations that AIPAC was accusing Hegel of anti-Semitism, and AIPAC was quiet. And I checked the AIPAC website; it hadn't mentioned it, right? But what was it? It was part of this. Right. It was part of this desire to what I call neocon support for Israel, and to make anyone who supports Israel caricatured as a right-wing AIPAC Bill Kristol, rabid, pro-Israel type. And we have to acknowledge complexity. We have to acknowledge the range of opinions within the AIPAC community. We have to acknowledge that AIPAC itself is being mugged and being caricatured as a right-wing organization when most AIPAC members are liberal.
Well, no, I think it's a very interesting discussion. This is good. But again, let's look at the causes here. I mean,
let's look at the what?
It's what?
I didn't hear what you said. Let's look at the.
I'm saying, like, when it's interesting, you're saying, okay, some Hegel defenders were trying to make criticism of him a neocon thing, but let's look at the whole kind of mission statement of Bill Kristol's Emergency Committee for Israel is to capture pro-Israel in a specifically partisan sense, to make it a GOP thing, to essentially argue that there are no place for any Zionists in the Democratic Party. So it seems a bit rich to me to complain that people are responding to Bill Kristol's efforts to make pro-Israel a conservative Republican thing by pointing out that that's what's happening.
Well,
does that make sense?
Yeah, but you've now got another one of the bees in my bonnet. I think that, and again, this goes back to 1975 when you saw an extraordinary bipartisan condemnation of the UN, not of Israel, when Israel was accused of being a racist state. And it goes back to 1991 when the UN vote was repealed, and it was due to bipartisan cooperation between Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a Democrat, and George H.W. Bush, a Republican. I think it's a huge mistake on the part of Republicans, and I object when they try to make Israel a wedge issue. And I think it's a huge mistake on the part of Democrats when they do the same thing. I think that support for Israel is and should be bipartisan. And when Romney tried to make it a wedge issue, I disagreed with him and I criticized him in the pages of the Jerusalem Post and Open Zion and elsewhere. But I also think that the Democratic Party has to acknowledge that whereas 20 years ago with Pat Buchanan and 40 years ago with John Bircher's anti-Israel forces in the United States, and I'm using that term specifically, found their home in the Republican Party, now to the extent that you have a hostile group to Israel, it's increasingly finding its home in the Democratic Party. And not all Democrats, but the Democrats have to acknowledge that and deal with that. And we saw that in the fight over the Jerusalem platform. And I want to be very careful in my language. I'm not saying all Democrats, but I'm saying it's something that the Democratic Party has to acknowledge in the same way that the Republican Party has to acknowledge that it has fanatics who are trying to own the Israel space and make it exclusive. I reject both.
Okay, I mean, a couple things there. I mean, I question how much of an actual place in the Democratic Party these forces have. To me, when I look at it, it seems to me that they are to the left of the Democratic Party and not very well represented in the actual machinery of the party. But we can disagree on that. I mean, as for the Jerusalem vote at the DNC, I mean, it was, first of all, substantively, that's just, I think, a bad plank for the platform.
Why? Because nobody's ever stood by it.
Well, right. I mean, if you're just saying, we need, the point is to have this, check this box it's just a bad policy. I mean, Jerusalem, substantively, Jerusalem is an issue for final status talks that'll be negotiated, and that's as it should be. But to interpret, I think that vote, that split vote, what was clearly fairly evenly split between the yeas and nays. It was not only Jerusalem, it was putting God back in the platform. And it was also a fairly out of the ordinary procedure that kind of shoved that in there. So it's unclear to me that, I don't think it's right to make that all about being anti-Israel.
No.
That's the criticism we got from conservatives.
We didn't have a boo meter, right? But to the extent that there was, some percentage of those boos had to do with Jerusalem and some percentage had to do with hostility to Israel, we just deal with it. I'm just saying, don't pretend that, in the same way that, one of the things that frustrated me during the presidential campaign was I never, ever, ever used the language of Barack Obama being anti-Israel. I think that's foolish and stupid. But I also never said that Barack Obama was Israel's BFF, best friends forever, best friend ever. Why is it that we can talk about all kinds of issues without having to go to such extreme language? And when we get to this issue, it has to be all or nothing. That, to me, is an internalization of this delegitimization talk, that the rhetorical temperature has been raised so much that you've got to be 100% or 0%. Let's acknowledge that there are differences. There are hawks and doves. There are pro-settlement, anti-settlement types. There are peace now or security obsessives. Let's find a different language and that lowers the temperature, but it also narrows the consensus such that we acknowledge that about which we agree, core values, deep interests. I love the phrase that President Obama used in his second inaugural describing the need for democracy in the Middle East. He said, our conscience and our interests, right? And to me, when I analyze American policy toward Israel, I think it's a matter of conscience and a matter of interest. And one reinforces the next. And it's not helpful to knock down either one.
Yeah. I mean, in the few minutes we have left here, I just want to return quickly to Hegel because I know, as you said, you are not a fan of this choice. Though I do acknowledge that you have used you've not used some of the more inflammatory language about him. But it seems to me some of the criticisms, though, of course, people are of course free to criticize choices and suggest some of the possible implications. But it seems to me some of the more hysterical criticisms of Hegel, and which are of course, criticisms of Obama for choosing Hegel and what it could mean for the U.S.-Israel relationship, tend to really disrespect the depth of the U.S.-Israel relationship that we were just discussing a few moments ago. Not only in terms of U.S. popular support for Israel, but also in terms of the massive cooperation that goes on at various levels between the two militaries, the intelligence cooperation, the economic cooperation. Just this idea that the choice of one former senator could upend this decades-old relationship seems to me to really, it lacks knowledge or appreciation of how deep and solid that relationship is.
I agree. I think my complaint about the hysteria is reinforced by this constant sense of the fragility, right? That there's this. But let's look a little more closely at the Hegel relationship from a different dimension. What I find dishonest about the Hegel debate is my understanding of Hegel's appeal to Obama is that he was a bit of a maverick in the Senate, and that he wasn't a conventional foreign policy guy. And then all of a sudden, when Obama, who likes him because he's unconventional, nominates him, everybody's busy making him this conventional guy, and so they're saying, well, Hegel was proud of the fact that he stood up to the quote-unquote Jewish lobby, whether he used, the language was less important than the act. He was saying, I'm not that guy who's going to march in lockstep with 97 other senators. I'm different. And that is going to make many people on the pro-Israel side a little bit nervous. You got to acknowledge that. You got to own it. So all of a sudden, and similarly, let's look at the fact that Obama is turning as a Secretary of Defense to a guy who's known as more of a dove on the Iran issue. It doesn't mean that he's going to roll over and send a bomb to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but it means that he's not Bill Kristol. So you have to own the symbolism, own the implications of that decision, and then fight it out. But it seemed to be everybody saying, well, no, he's not that, even though he was that. And the other thing I'll say is that you're right. A Secretary of Defense should be argued about, should be debated, but especially in the Obama White House, it seems that most policy, and you can ask outgoing Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, you can ask outgoing Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, most policy comes from the White House. So this is kind of a bit of a game about reading the tea leaves, or where's Obama, heading, and what's he feeling. But fundamentally, Kerry and Hegel are more people who are going to implement the president's policies than make the president's policies. That's my read.
All right. I think that's a great place to stop. Thanks so much for doing this. Look forward to having you on again.
Great. And thanks for doing all your good work. You raised the level of debate.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Bye-bye.